Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It is Tuesday. It is in the morning hours in the United States. We will just ask our special guest of these last year, or the last show in the year 2021.
Not the last year, I hope.
No.
Hallelujah. No.
Don't spread rumors, man.
Just put it on erase and just let me start again.
Yeah, I need something to do with my Tuesdays.
I'm so flashed to have Stephen LeMay, who I met first on one of the CRM Players Bars and Grill meetings, very informally, and learned a lot of what he did in his former business life and still up to date, and that he is, if COVID is allowing or other circumstances, also in Germany from time to time, and that he has there certain knowledge. So very much welcome, Stephen, to our show, and very much everybody who is staying with us today to the last show in 2021. Coming up a lot of more shows in 2022, and so on and so on and so on. And we are just thinking, due to the demand of the community, if we do a focused small medium business spin-off. But this is a 2022 topic, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Stephen, the floor is yours. Would you please help our audience to get a clue what things you have done so far and where you did your research as a professor?
Well, thank you, Ralph and Thomas and Marshall, for having me on. I'm delighted to be here. I did my doctorate in transportation and logistics at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. We argue that it's one of the top programs in the world to get your doctorate in transportation and logistics. So, I also have a master's in operations management from UT, and one of my major qualifications for being here at this moment is I've known Paul Greenberg since 1967. We met in the fall of 1967. We both majored in journalism at Northwestern University. And Paul and I sat together in history of journalism on the first day of class in the fall of '67. History of journalism. But I've done a lot of research. I was a Russian linguist for the Air Force for 6 years after I graduated, and then went to graduate school in phys ed and philosophy, and finally operations management, transportation and logistics. A lot of my research has taken me in the direction of, if you take a supply chain and look at it in terms of what is the network composed of, it would be infrastructure, equipment, technology, as in information technology, and people. And I've done a lot of my work on the people side of things, but my dissertation was on strategic information systems in the trucking industry. So kind of a blend there, but a lot of focus in supply chain design and in setting up, in the way networks are set up, and also in supply chain ethics. A lot of recent publications, co-author out of, as a matter of fact, Kiel University, who just finished her PhD there. I'm an external research fellow at the University of Kiel's Center for Globalization, Transportation and Logistics. A lot of.
So, in reply to Zach, oh yeah, you will have. Although, and this is probably the surprise. I mean, everybody's talking about CX these days. Why the heck are we talking to a supply chain guy here? So what do you think is the impact on supply chain on CX?
Well, first of all, under normal circumstances, supply chain is sort of assumed. That is, the average consumer looks at stuff magically appears on the shelf at Walmart. Stuff magically appears at Target. It magically appears at the grocery store. We don't think about how it got there until it's disrupted, and that's
very well, yeah.
And so there, and even in business to business, there are parts of it that are not analyzed very well. So it's not something that customers think about that much most of the time. And I thought, in sort of the pre-show commentary, I think Ralph was asking about Amazon.
Of course.
And Amazon's website's not that pretty, and all of that kind of thing.
Our omnipotent friend, yeah.
But there are a couple of things there. One, Amazon was very, very good for Prime membership, for example. Before COVID, was very good at the 2-day delivery. That is, if they promised 2-day delivery, you probably got it. They were over 99% of the time. They were precise on that, and that's what people were looking for from them. It was okay. It shows up when I want it. If I'm looking overall at the measure of supply chain effectiveness, as far as customers are concerned, it's, do you have my stuff? That is, did you get to me the right product at the right time at the right place? Very simple. It's not whether you smiled when you talked to me or not. It is, did you have my stuff? And especially from a business to business standpoint.
Yeah.
And what I see has happened with Amazon during COVID is people were forgiving. That is, they realized, okay, Amazon can't operate the way it normally does, the supply chain. And this is the thing that really changed with COVID. You had the president of the United States talking about supply chains. That is, all of a sudden it became conscious because it was one of those things where some of the shelves at Walmart were empty. And Amazon wasn't delivering.
A glimpse of a clue, being a business person himself, yeah.
Yeah, it's that was a huge change, and
yeah,
there's one of the lessons I think we learned there is supply chains can be too lean, and they can be too long, and they can also be out of your control.
Yeah.
If we take an early example, and all of this only brings supply chain into customer experience because now it's negative, i.e. the supply chain disrupted, now I can't get my stuff. But if you take somebody very early in COVID, the PPE serves as the example.
Right.
The nitrile gloves, before COVID, we made none of them in the United States. Zero. They were all imported from China. Well, when China started seeing a need for those things, they're going, okay, we're going to use them here. We're not going to ship them to the US, we're going to use them here. And the same thing was applying to masks and other things like that we supplied them a long way off. And you had people who offered to produce them in the United States, but they were looking at, there was a manufacturer in Texas who said, I'll make them. But here's the problem I have. If I ramp up I'm making them now, but if I ramp up my production to a 24/7 operation, I have to hire a lot of extra people. I'm going to hire those extra people. At some point, that short-term demand, that bubble is going to burst. And then I'm going to be stuck with paying all these people that I lay off unemployment benefits. Can you figure out a way to deal with that? And the answer was no. So he didn't ramp up production. Well, I mean, and so you had hospitals with serious shortages, and you had not-for-profits and others coming in to try to figure out how to get those critical supplies to the people who needed them.
We did. Catherine Bonesteel,
I was going to mention,
a mutual friend of ours, had an organization specifically for that.
There's Nick's COVID. She founded it.
That's the one.
She founded that and distributed literally billions of pieces of stuff that she was able to uncover. But what you had, when you're talking about the customer experience, you had some bizarre responses from the customers, like at one point she received 6 requests from one state for the same order. That is, here was the same quantity that everybody was wanting, and this one state ordered it from 6 different directions. And she's going, this is weird. Why is this all the same quantity? And it's for 6 different people, and it's all for really from one state. And you go, you had, so essentially what they were doing was betting against themselves. And this, you have that happening in the supply chain because of the shortage. And again, it part of that is customers and particularly consumers assume the supply chain. They just, this stuff's going to show up, and then until it doesn't. And a lot of businesses, when you look at the idea of a managed supply chain, that's not the same as a supply chain. You've always got a supply chain. But how much of it can you manage? How far forward and how far back? Not that many companies in the B2B space are actually managing all the way to the consumer. If I'm a second or third tier supplier or automobile manufacturer, I just do what I'm told. I'm not looking at the far end, but of course it has a ripple effect coming back. And you go back to those components of the network that you're trying to manage, there are capacity issues, so we have the Port of LA, for example, has been somewhat controversial. Their problems there have been relieved somewhat, but some of the problem came from China has a COVID problem. They shut down their port because they have the COVID outbreak at their port. They shut that port down. Now they're not shipping them. The ships aren't moving because they aren't loading them. Then they come back. They get in a hurry. They've got plenty of capacity. They load the ships up. Now a whole bunch of ships are coming at the same time as opposed to the usual level. Now you have more ships show up to be unloaded at Long Beach and LA. Now you have a backup. And then you have other process-related problems associated with where do you put the empty containers. Thomas and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday. There were ships going back empty because the rates were so high, it wasn't worth letting the ship hang around to get reloaded with empty containers, because the price for a container was 6 times what it had been before COVID.
Hallelujah.
It was up. I've talked to people who were involved with paying $30,000 to ship one container out of China to the U.S. West Coast, and the quote unquote normal price is about $2,500.
And what they could get for hauling one container back was ridiculously low at the same time, right?
Well, also you have to think of the ship itself as inventory for Maersk and all the other big shipping companies. And having that inventory sit idle while it's waiting to get reloaded is millions of dollars worth of their inventory sitting there doing nothing, waiting in line to get empty containers loaded on it, when it could go back over, pick up another load and bring that and make $15,000 per container.
Yeah, it's like what happens in a big city when all the traffic lights suddenly go out.
And I wanted to go back to the gloves and mask problem, because in the first wave, such as just get a mask, a face mask, standardized, non-FFP2, which came later, suddenly a lot of people started making masks. Call centers were shut down because they had no jobs in acquisition. And a lady who is doing an event marketing business just had the people which have the knowledge of sewing, has the machinery and has the cotton and all the other ingredients. She started to produce in masses face masks in specific company design or just plain in white, blue, black, God knows what. And she saved her organization from going bankrupt. She didn't need to unemploy loyal employees. And this was one of the aspects which creative thinking, such as right after the war, everybody has to work on what he had, such as be creative with what you have. This has been taken for some parts of Germany around about 50 years, because they were used to shortages and to a certain creativity in making something out of nothing.
Yes.
In smart recycling, just to do that. This is one chapter. The other chapter is, as Christy was asking, what do you do if you cannot supply? And what I experienced over the last 18 months was, even that they were short in the products with existing customer relationships, they tried to serve as fast in smaller amounts as they could. So you had a clear differentiation in some B2B businesses, such as when the stuff is coming in, you are one of the first to get it. This was phase one. In phase two, it came to the point that at a sudden, the purchasing management and the purchasing marketing changed in a complete different way. If you had a cooperation or a cooperative way of doing marketing with your vendor who is supplying you, such as he gets a label on your product, such as I use the chemics from BASF in my drilling machines, Bosch Handbohrer label, we produce it with a shockproof product. So they had an advertising spin on that product. That was one method which was working. Another was that they looked for other options to compensate the stuff which is now not available on every corner any longer.
Yeah, well, but before I respond to you, I'm going to answer Christy. One of the people that we talked to in that B2B space works at a chemical company here in Pensacola, and they're a continuous process. And they've been able to put some software on top of, they're an SAP user. They use some software on top of that, as opposed to doing Excel analysis. And they were able to communicate with their customer to say, okay, we have a shortage. We're going to be late with this delivery. You can lower your production rate rather than have to shut it down when you run out. So part of what they were able to do is communicate more quickly with their business-to-business customer. And that customer, instead of having to shut down entirely and then bring their production back online, they could go to 50 or 80% production or some lower level. And that's far less expensive than bringing it up. And it wasn't, and what we're talking about in this particular instance, because they had that customer, that additional software, they could analyze it more quickly. And so we're only talking about a difference of hours.
Wow.
But that was enough to make a big difference in terms of being able to communicate quickly with their customer and say, okay, this is going to be 16 hours late, so you can scale back your production a little bit until the shipment's going to arrive about this time. And we're able to do this analysis because this software, instead of downloading to Excel, was gathering data live. So I think it's very much situational. But what you see is in the supply chain, first of all, when I did my dissertation research, there were trucking companies thinking about maybe putting their payroll on a PC. You know, seriously, I talked to a small trucking company that was, yeah, maybe we're going to put this on a PC. Now, you talk about IT-enabled supply chains. And so they're adopting the customer experience software and the notion of, okay, and understanding that General Motors is not a person. General Motors doesn't experience anything. But the people who work at General Motors who decided to buy from you do experience something. So, and one of your jobs is the person who chose you as a supplier, they need to look good to their boss. So part of their experience with you is they communicate well with us, and when we have a shortage or a problem, or as you were saying, Ralph, we're giving you this priority. You know exactly where you stand in line. If you're an automaker, you know exactly where you stand in line in terms of getting the microchips that you need to put into your into the car so you can send them to the dealerships.
The just-in-time process optimization is when I get it right, such as the seats for the car take some more time, so slow down a bit with the car production.
Sure.
So you have less harm, and we keep you posted. So the interchange of the exchange of information has been optimized to make it smooth.
Yes, the thing is, there's a point at which you're putting those motherboards, for example, into the car.
Yeah.
If you don't, if there's no point in making the stuff up to that point and then stopping and waiting for 3 weeks to get motherboards. You need to do something else, as you suggested. If there's something else that you can be doing in the meantime, by all means, do that. But the supply chain essentially has gone from, okay, we're going to do things on 3x5 cards. Those same trucking companies that I was talking to 40 years ago, 30 or 35 years ago, are now among the most sophisticated users of telecommunications and information technology anywhere in the world. And it's why, if you want to know, I believe one of our fellows on the Happier Hour mentioned he had an order that was sitting in line in a container at the Port of LA. I believe he was complaining about that. Well, we can know that now, and we can know it to a very fine point. In fact, a lot of people scale that back a little bit because you don't want people to be able to hack in and find out too closely where something is, because that makes it easier to steal. Oh, that truck is stopped at that truck stop right now. Let's go over, break in, and take the good stuff.
Exactly.
On the other hand, knowing where it is in Port of LA doesn't help you a lot if it's in the bottom of the stack, right?
Yeah, and if it's still waiting to be unloaded. But that kind of thing can, we regularly get notifications using Amazon again. We regularly get notifications now. This shipment has been delayed, or hey, it's coming early. You're going to get it. We said it was going to be Wednesday. Here it's coming.
For ships, it's public domain, right? There are plenty of websites that give the position data of the ships simply because they must give it.
Yes, and well, they're supposed to anyway.
Naval ships probably don't do it, but
don't look too closely at the way that's being done off the coast of North Korea and Russia.
But still should be reasonably accurate for container ships, isn't it?
Yeah. There's no question about that. But you do see places where they're supposed to have those transponders on and they're not. And it's usually because things are being shipped to places they're not supposed to be shipped to.
Yeah, off the Horn of Africa, you probably have it off as well.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah,
but you're seeing more and more attention. If you go and look at, I think it's Apollo, or I'm trying to remember the name exactly. There's software where you can go look at a transportation company and it will tell you what technology they're using, and you can go identify the software. that they're using and see what they're employing. And an awful lot of it now is CRMCX related software, because they know the better they communicate, the more effective it is. Now, again, you have that problem of the shipping. They're just not setting the standards and saying, okay, these ships need to show, if they say they're going to be there in 30 days, they need to be here somewhere between 28 and 32. I mean, the variability is much longer than that. And oddly enough, much smaller variations in delivery are far more attention is paid to the truck was late. Then the truck was late because the ship was late. That is, they're holding the motor carriers responsible in ways that they don't hold the shipping companies responsible. And I think some of it is simply, okay, things are out on the ocean, who knows?
It's easier. I think it might be because it's easier to fire a trucker than it is to fire a ship captain.
Yeah, but nobody wants to fire a trucker. It's too hard to get them these days.
Yeah, right now it's probably easier to get a captain.
Industry average at this moment is about 100% annual turnover, and it's a little bit lower for smaller trucking companies, but it's still extremely high. And again, the service disruptions, the big thing that affects the customer experience is being able to communicate about them. And what the customers seem to appreciate greatly is, you let me know that this was going to be, specifically, it was going to be missing. You let me know when it was going to show up. And it showed up somewhere close enough to that time for me to make good business decisions. And there again, it's creating it's the software environment in which each of them is operating that makes a difference. And again, for some of this stuff, being able to use real-time data versus downloaded, now let's play with Excel for a while, now we talk about it, that difference matters. And that changes the customer experience. But supply chains remain relatively inefficient. And it's one of the things I talk to when I'm talking to my students about, hey, there's a career to be had here. It's because there's so many improvements still to be made. When on-time delivery, perfect order percentage is sometimes used as a measure.
Hi, Christy.
Hi, Christy.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too.
If on-time delivery is 20% for international shipments, obviously there's a lot to be improved on. And from a conceptual standpoint, and this is where I think the customer experience is going to become more and more important. And by the way, the software related to the customer experience becomes more important as we start talking about closed loop and circular supply chains. And that's the idea that from product design to product disposal, it's all, we design a product that can be disposed of in such a way that it can either be reused or recycled or repurposed. And consequently, there's very little waste. We've had this lean thinking for so long, and in some ways we're measuring lean the wrong way. That is, we're measuring lean strictly in dollars, and we're measuring in dollars in the short run. And what that means is you have no capacity to deal with disruptions.
Exactly.
So if you were looking at going back to the PPE, for example, that's something that we had a pandemic. We might not have another one for decades. We don't know. We have no way of predicting that. But then we have reserve stockpiles of oil. Why not have a reserve stockpile of PPE where you have continuous turnover so the inventory doesn't age, and you can redesign that and say, okay, we have a stockpile of this stuff in case we have this kind of emergency again.
Yeah.
Even if we don't, we can keep cycling that through, let's say a federal project in the US or in Germany where you have that stuff available. You have 3 months worth for an emergency, for example, but you keep moving it through, i.e. you bring in new, but you move it back out into the open market so that it doesn't age while sitting in the warehouse collecting spiders. There are things that can be done about this, and capacity restrictions are the things that affect customer experience at the time of disruption. And so if you look at what I was talking about earlier, we've improved the technology, the software, so much, but it's still underused. That is, and I think Thomas can speak to this pretty well, and that is SAP is used by a lot of companies, but it's not necessarily used well. It has lots of features that don't get fully expressed in those companies because learning new stuff is hard. But in addition to that, you have things like, okay, governments, corporations, not-for-profits, multinational organizations can all affect that capacity by saying, okay, we need to do something with the port. We need to create more space around that port in LA where land is so expensive. If you're going to stack up empty containers somewhere,
is that the right solution?
You need well, the other thing you might do, and it's very difficult to do in California, but because of their regulations, but bigger port. That is more room, more space allocated to the port. Now, California is very reluctant to do that. And
just sticking to that example, so there's the stockpile of empty containers in LA. Kind of 500,000 of them. So which are sorely missing on the other side of the Pacific, say in Shanghai.
They're finding it cheaper to make new ones.
Yeah, but it's not a solution to put more stockpile.
It's not sustainable.
More space into the or outside the harbor of LA.
Well, they have they've created some agreements that are 25 or 30 miles away where the land is cheaper, and what they're using is parking lots for factories that have been somewhat idled, and paid a couple $1 million for the privilege to the city of Carson City, California, which is a bit away from the port. But now you still have to get the empties out of the port. You still have the problem of getting drivers and vehicles in to get the empties out of the port itself. And so that's actually become the restriction on the port's productivity, is they don't have any place to put stuff to be staged long enough to be, it's off the ship, now a truck comes to get it.
So what would be a possibility to incentivize getting them where they are needed?
Again, in the short term, you're simply looking at higher rates to move stuff through. And in order to have enough truck drivers, you have to pay more per load because they're not able to get through to pick up loads quickly enough to make a living. So truck drivers are going, I don't want to do that. I might have to wait in line for 3 or 4 hours just to get a load, and then wait another hour or two to get out. And now I've done 1 or maybe 2 loads a day. And that's not enough to make a living at the current rate. So one of the things you might have to do is raise that so more drivers are willing to actually do this. But also the process of getting into the port and out of the port is so slow at those ports. Now, it's improved. It's gotten a lot better. Some of that was, the federal government suggested some changes in policy, like operating 24/7, which those ports were not doing for some reason. And I think they're probably the only major global ports that were not operating 24/7.
Okay.
Yeah, that was odd, to say the least. But it's not that easy to ship those ships to other ports, because the other ports are not prepared for those big. They're not ready for those kind of container ships. And you have the very largest container ships, and I mean, there was the announcement about the one that's 23,000 TEUs, 20-foot equivalents. That's an LNG just put into service. We don't have a port that will serve a ship that big. The United States doesn't. It's not deep enough. It's not, the channels are not deep enough and not wide enough to handle it. So it's one of those things that's going to go from, say, Hamburg to Malta, or Amsterdam to Malta, and then perhaps through the Suez Canal to Shanghai, because those ports can handle it. But it's not going to come here, because we have to send the Corps of Engineers out to dig a deeper channel on a regular basis as these ships get bigger.
Which they regularly do with the LB to get into Hamburg. But then there are plenty of ships that are not as big and that they are just idling around as well. So there is a huge overcapacity in the shipping industry right now. So
yes,
why isn't there a chance to use some of these?
Well, there you remember, the capacity is defined by a combination of infrastructure, equipment, technology, and people. And right now, most of the crews that might get on those ships are going, I'm not going to get on that ship because I might get COVID, and then my ship might not be able to land. I might be stuck, and I might also, of course, be sick, and I might die.
Yeah, good point.
So it's difficult. You keep in mind that a lot of those ships they're very complex international entities, if you will. You might have a ship that's owned by a Greek company, operated by it's owned by Greeks, operated by Maersk. The captain is from Denmark. The crew is from the Philippines. The shipment is from China, and its destination is Germany. And the companies represented in the shipment are Chinese, American, German, Norwegian, UK, and Brazilian.
And so the flag is under Panama for the insurance.
Yes. And it's likely that some financial institution in the UK has insured the shipment. So but the crewing issue with COVID is a big issue right now, and that is assuring that, and especially some of the there are some countries that will give you a flag for your ship no matter what. Panamanian, among others, where Liberia used to be notorious for it. Pay your fee and get your flag, and they're not really that careful about inspecting the ship to make sure that it's that seaworthy. Okay, people are very much, the potential crews are very much concerned about how safe those things are. All of this washes through, and eventually it becomes a supply chain issue for a consumer in the developed world. And again, so much of it, what has improved the customer experience is the fact that we're dealing in the developed world with IT enabled supply chains. So the customers, whether they're B2B or B2C, are being kept up to date about here's where your stuff is, here's when you're likely to get it.
Okay, so what you are basically telling me right now is that we need to go from IT-enabled to IT-powered supply chain, which means that the ships are fully autonomous and smaller.
Well,
Interesting.
that's interesting, and what's
solving the
odd
crewing
about
issue, at
that
least.
is that might actually be more doable than autonomous trucks.
Yeah, I think so as well. Yeah,
In part because
at least outside the harbors.
There's a lot of empty space in the ocean.
Yeah.
there's a lot of empty space in the ocean. Where you would run into any problems you might have would be as you got closer to the ports. But there are some things you can actually do about that. One is have points of interchange that are away from the port, so you have smaller delivery vehicles coming into the ports, for example. And ships and trucks could both be autonomous, but the autonomous vehicles on land are having trouble dealing with unpredictable vehicles.
So many humans around. Yeah.
Well, what really they were experimenting with it some in the Netherlands, and they found that the autonomous trucks had trouble dealing with bicycles.
Mm-hmm.
The bicycles were far less predictable than cars, and consequently, the trucks were constantly stopping because they didn't know what that bike was going to do.
That's okay because a driver will just run the biker over. I'd say that's an improvement.
Well, the truckers actually deal better with it than the autonomous guys do overall. And this is me making the argument, and that is you're going to have a hard time dealing with both driver operated and autonomous vehicles in the same place at the same time. That is, you can have one or you can have the other. At least in the early stages, it's going to be very difficult to have both.
Yeah, they can't negotiate with one another.
Yes.
You can have a programmed system where the autonomous vehicles will queue naturally, or you have a system where it's all drivers and people communicate. They figure out how
people communicate and they figure it out. I.e.,
when
the traffic lights go out in Chicago, drivers eventually figure out, okay, we're going to go for a while. Okay, now we're going to let you guys go for a while. They sort it out eventually. Usually even before a traffic policeman shows up to direct it. They start going, okay, you've got a turn. Okay, now let's stop. You get a turn. It starts to rotate. It starts acting like there was a light there.
Right.
The autonomous vehicles can probably be programmed to simply, take their turns and go. But if you try to throw both of them in there, it's problematic. And I mean, these changes in infrastructure change the way people deal with it. So in the U.S., we have a lot of trouble with roundabouts. And of course, in the UK and in most of Europe, roundabouts are fairly common. Roundabouts are a lot less expensive to maintain than traffic lights. I mean, you build a roundabout and occasionally you repave it, as opposed to traffic lights, which have to be dealt with, and you have to deal with issues like that all the time. Well, we still aren't that used to roundabouts, and so we've got people who are stopping, we've got people who are diving in when they shouldn't. We're like, I don't know what to do.
Look at the Champs-Élysées, look at the roundabout there, look at 2 or 3, which are very famous in Hanover, the ways to the fairground, the ways of the fairground. They, when there were still C-bits, they were capable to get masses in one way through the Autobahn and completely combining the traffic system to make it happen that all the people could move as quick as possible to the fairgrounds.
It works great, but now come and try that in Brooklyn, and drivers just lose their shit. They have no idea what they're doing.
And you do not want to be on one of these secondary lanes that come in from the side.
No.
At that point in time, secondary. That's why back where I lived in Christchurch, they rebuilt traffic light systems from roundabouts.
Uh-huh.
Because in the morning there have been two streets of equal importance.
Oh,
Just that one had more traffic than the other in the mornings and in the evenings, which led to huge traffic jams.
Well, one of the things about the infrastructure issue and about supply chains in general is we're talking about the human experience of those things, and particularly the infrastructure.
Yeah.
People feel strange around trucks, for example. They feel threatened by the trucks, even though the truck drivers are far less likely to be involved in accidents. They're professionals. They do this all the time. It's their job. They were trained for it. They are far less likely to be involved in an accident or to be at fault in an accident than people driving cars. I mean, that's the statistics are very clear on that. By the same token, people are very nervous around that truck. They feel walled in, and their perceptions of the truck as a threat is an issue. One of the things that could be done is to have dedicated lanes for long-haul trucks, dedicated roads even. Then you could go to autonomous trucks. And one of the things about this is you can create something that's more reliable. Of course, you already have defined lanes for some things, and I mean it's used far more in Europe, and that it's called a train.
Yeah, I was wondering when we were going to get to that.
What's that?
Well, I mean, we of course we do nothing to speak of with passenger trains in the United States. Some of it is geography, some of it is just national policy. I mean, if you look at national policy in the U.S., we committed ourselves to highway transportation in the 1930s, and then we doubled down on it in the 1950s with the expressway, with the national highway system, and and we've not done the same thing with high-speed rail, in part because we make the argument that we've got too much of a big hole in terms of population in the center of the country. If you go out in Montana, Wyoming, and so on, one way to figure it out is simply look at a map that shows you the locations of Walmart stores.
What's left of the good old Western time? We conquer the United States, and we have the train as the medium of transport. And when I visited some years ago the United States, I was just looking around what's left over, such as the last thing I found was Amtrak. And from time to time in one of the spectacular movies, you get trains hijacked and used as weapons, and you get trains which are smashing into a station, unfortunately, and cause some disaster. But that's not what my expectation is on having a smooth ride. Yeah. And
no. If you look at the safety statistics, let's face it, that literal train wreck makes headlines, but it's really uncommon. It doesn't happen very often. It's not nearly
making headlines.
Well, I mean, it's just like airline. When an airliner crashes, it makes headlines. It's because it's unusual. But I mean, by far the safest mode of transportation in the United States, in terms of per million passenger miles and so on, is commercial air. By the way, by far the most dangerous is general aviation. Private aircraft are not. But highway transportation has far more fatalities than commercial air, and rail rail deaths per passenger mile, very small number. And what Zach has said, perceptions slow these things, and people's lack of experience with them. I mean, the federal government offered the state of Florida the opportunity to build some high-speed rail with 90% of it paid by the feds.
Yeah.
The governor chose not to do it. Well, that means that Floridians still haven't really experienced what it's like to be able to take an hour to go from Miami to Orlando, for example, as opposed to getting on the highway. And
one day you will find an offer from Shanghai to get the German developed Transrapid properly done by the Chinese in the version 4.0, and then you can afford it, and you will be surprised what an ingenious innovation this was, but Germany was not capable to utilize it like the MP3 format they invented to make money out of it. Yeah,
well, there's no real use case in Germany as well for a Transrapid.
Yeah, there was an attempt in the United States to create high-speed rail through the Northeast Corridor, Amtrak running up to Boston through New York Penn Station down to Washington, D.C., the Excella train. It's not high-speed rail. The program got just torn to pieces. The difference between taking a regular train on those trips and taking an Excella is about half an hour.
Yeah.
It's not high-speed rail. And I have to wonder, we have been talking in the country about infrastructure investment. Is it going to make a difference?
Well, yes.
I hope so.
Well, the big place that's going to make the difference is that the bridges aren't going to fall down.
Yes,
that
is
is
a
a lot
good
of what we're
thing.
doing, but it's not the same thing as the investment in the when Eisenhower pushed through the National Defense Highway System, interstate highway system, he was looking at the future.
Yeah.
He was looking at the future, and what he envisioned worked out pretty well for us. I mean, if you look at the logistics costs as a percentage of GDP, the U.S. leads the world by a substantial margin. It's less than 9% of our GDP for logistics, and in Germany, for example, it's more like 10 to 12. Some of that was changes in regulation dating back to 1980. In 1980, it was 15%. Now it's less than 9%. That's 6 or 7 cents on everything you buy. That's a pretty big deal. But we have not come together to say, okay, here's how we envision the future and how it ought to be, and whether it's going to be autonomous vehicles, high-speed rail, any of those things. We haven't made those choices, and they are important choices because they change how we live. So we're not talking about. Yes, we're talking about the customer experience, but we're also talking about more of the citizen experience in all of these things. That is, this is going to affect how you deliver goods, but also how people move. All of those things are going to be affected by that. Right now, we lead the world on that percentage. Are we going to lead the world on that percentage in 25 years?
How about
that requires doing something now, because infrastructure doesn't happen overnight.
How about Zach's statement in that context?
Say what?
Zach's
statement in that context.
Yeah, the threat, whether real or.
I mean, there is no question that when people say we're not going to do that, it's because one, there is fear, and it's fear of the unknown. Now, I think we're one way or the other. I think the autonomous vehicles will be held to a higher standard because we expect more of robots. I mean, it's just
That's true. We expect more. And let's face it, the perception will be if the autonomous vehicles don't do any better than people, why have the autonomous vehicles?
That was going to be my next point.
And there are
hey, I contributed.
Marshall is too smart.
Yeah.
Why aren't you a PhD?
That if you go to the artificial intelligence driven systems and whatsoever, that they still not manage the thing what we humans do, which is the ethical questions on whom to hit and kill.
Well, there are several ethical issues in there, and one of the things is the more quote unquote robotic we come, i.e., the more we rely on AI and robots, distinguishing those things. Okay, what is the robot's motive? I.e., how that is, there's without human intervention, what's the robot's motive? People are the ones that create the motives and consequently have the ethical issues one way or the other. So then it becomes how you design the robot, what the robot is designed to do, how it's designed to do it, even how it's built, what kind of labor is used.
Programs.
Yes.
Yeah.
What programs are used, whether the programs are biased or not, for example. I mean, those are issues. But those go back to the people who build them and use them. And if we do become that automated, what will people do? If we can push a button and get everything done, all right, now what?
Well, there is something I envision that it will go step by step, but we have to be clear that what in Germany a professor in AI and ethics has undertaken as research, that she said at the end of the day, we program 100 lines of code. Out of these 100 lines of code, at least 10 are not working properly. So now see how many million lines of code are used by an artificial intelligence to drive an autonomous vehicle. So not going to the aspect that a female programmer is programming a different way than a male programmer. So you have another challenge. And now you need the reckoning power, you need the data centers, which are driving all these millions of autonomous driving vehicles and steering them.
Well, you bring up what is a major issue there. And we've been really talking about supply chains with material goods, but there are supply chains for services as well. And that's all about capacity. And so you have, I mean, one of the controversies about Bitcoin is very simply, they use a lot of energy. They are a carbon producer. But that also, so is AWS.
Yeah.
I mean, AWS has lots of servers that are burning lots of fuel. They have distribution centers that do nothing but handle servers. I mean, they have to have, because their servers burn out like any other piece of equipment. So they have to be replaced. There are a lot of them. They have dedicated distribution centers that do nothing but replace servers.
Look, looking as we are coming up to the hour, what do you think from a scholarship or from a scholar point of view are the top learnings that we took out of the out of the past years of crisis with respect to supply chain?
Well, I think one of the biggest issues is we're going to need to redefine what we mean by lean. That is, I'm looking at the textbooks that are written that I'm going to teach out of starting in 2 weeks. And they're all about making it lean in this traditional way. And there's a difference between lean and resilient right now. And sometimes you get you're resilient just because you got lucky, i.e., you had already adopted a policy and it happened to be a policy that was good in the context of whatever disruption came along. But sometimes you can be conscious about it. So you're talking about things like having some reserves for PPE, for example, and other things like that. While that's not technically lean in terms of minimizing cost, it's lean in terms of being effective. And I think some of our supply chains were shown to be anorexic as opposed to lean. So maybe that's the distinction that we need to make. So we need to start also, one of the things that we tend to neglect in talking about supply chains is at every step along the supply chain, governments play a role. Absolutely, governments play a role. There's no such thing as a supply chain without government involvement, because they operate the ports. They also decide what can and cannot be imported. They decide what the tariffs are going to be for things that are imported. Read some of the stuff about Brexit and cheese right now. The Brits who are exporting cheese to Germany and other parts of the EU are finding that the tariff is now 274% of the price. So the European market, the European market's gone as far as they're concerned. I mean, their distributors in Germany and Norway are going, hey, no, we're not going to buy it for you. You're too expensive. Your $30 cheese has a 274% tariff on it. Sorry, none of our people are going to pay $200 for your cheese. 200 euro.
So no Appenzeller from me over here anymore.
So what it amounts to is, I think that's one of the major things, is we need to figure out less just in time and more just in case.
From the companies did follow up to that one. Companies already did do some changes. What of them, or how much of that change will stick?
I think a lot of that will stick, and I think others will learn lessons from it. I think you're seeing more and more written about the resilience notion. And I've written some of this myself about the difference between agility and resilience. Agile is the ability to respond quickly to something that's happening right now. But if you're not already resilient, your agility is not going to matter. If I were to say, okay, resilience is down here, agility is up here. If I'm not resilient, I don't care how agile I am. If I'm not sufficiently resilient, I'm gone.
Resilience?
What?
Isn't agility a way to get resilience?
Well, I think from a strictly conceptual standpoint, that's a tough one to distinguish. And I don't think the literature has done a very good job of it.
Yet another research project.
Time for you to start writing the textbooks, maybe, Stephen.
Well, I have one out there already, but it's now 20 years old, or close to that.
Time for an update.
It was translated into Chinese and, for some reason, Croatian.
Interesting.
I understand translating it into Chinese. I really do. There's a market.
Well,
I don't know why somebody got paid to translate it into Croatian.
Well, his
I have no
customer was
objection
really
to that.
interested in it.
I don't. Yeah, and I find oddly that I can read it in Croatian. In some ways, Croatian is like a transliterated Russian, so I could easily read through it. But when they sent me a copy of it, I was very much astonished.
Okay, so we are really over time. So I believe Ralph has a favorite. I'll ask it. Your top predictions for 2022 in terms of supply chain from a university point of view. What will happen?
You're going to see a whole lot more. You're going to see a whole lot more programs in supply chains turn up. You're already seeing that because supply chain has now come to people's attention, and the job opportunities are there. It's a job that pays well. The other thing is you're going to see a lot of focus on circular and closed loop supply chains. in terms of research, but also you're going to see a lot of focus on resilience. That's where a lot of the research is going to come out. You've already seen a lot of it in terms of COVID response. The other thing that's come out of this is you're seeing a major shift in the way journals operate, academic journals operate, partly because the traditional journals, especially the leading journals, have proven themselves to be so slow in terms of, it's great in that the peer review takes a long time and they go through this process, but sometimes it takes 2 years to go from here's a concept, here's my paper, here it is in print. There are other journals arising now that have slightly different business models that are much quicker to here's your review, here's what our reviewers, our experts said about it, respond to these, now you're either in or you're out at a much faster rate. The biggest struggle that a lot of the traditional journals have these days is getting reviewers, and some of them have now created, because we don't get much credit for doing reviews. I mean, in terms of teaching research and service, reviewing is one of those things that's kind of at the bottom of the list over here on the list of services you might do to the trade. So it's there. But I think those are going to be some of the major thrusts, and particularly resilience with respect to major supply chain disruptions. And then you're going to have a lot of research that's simply going back and unraveling a lot of what happened in the supply chains during COVID, because we're all still a little bit stunned. Okay, this happened. Here's the effect of it. How did it happen? What are the mechanics behind that? That's not that easy. That's not that easy to grasp immediately.
Okay. I think those have been great, famous last words of the year.
I think it's enough to take us into 2022.
Thanks for coming, Steve.
Hey,
I think
thank you so much for having me.
Yourself a seat, an episode in the hot seat, which is another project of next year.
I've been in the hot seat before. It'll be all right.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks to everybody who was there. Going backstage now. Happy New Year to everybody.
Happy New Year.
See you on the other side of New Year's Eve.